Have you ever wondered how some of the biggest British stars in Hollywood managed to become legends while making decisions that left friends and colleagues completely baffled? From reckless career moves to bizarre public antics, these stars proved that talent and common sense do not always travel together. Today we count down 15 British classic Hollywood stars who were dumbest, and the higher we go, the stranger the stories become. Stay until number 1 because that story is almost impossible to believe. Number 15, Norman Wisdom. Few performers built an entire career around looking completely clueless, quite like Norman Wisdom. Audiences loved him because he seemed like an ordinary man constantly losing battles against everyday life. On screen, he tripped over obstacles, misunderstood simple instructions, and somehow turned confusion into comedy gold. The remarkable part was how naturally he made it all look. Many directors admitted that Wisdom often behaved off-screen in ways that reinforced his public image. He could forget instructions moments after hearing them, and frequently wandered into situations that left production crews shaking their heads. Instead of hurting his career, these moments strengthened his reputation as Britain's most lovable fool. What made Wisdom unique was that he never tried to appear sophisticated. While other actors worked hard to project intelligence and elegance, he embraced simplicity. Fans connected with him because he reminded them of the average person making mistakes and somehow surviving them. His films became international hits and turned him into one of Britain's most recognizable entertainers. Whether he was crashing through doors or creating chaos without meaning to, Wisdom proved that sometimes the world's greatest success comes from appearing completely lost. Number 14, Benny Hill. At first glance, Benny Hill looked like a man who had discovered the secret formula for comedy. The reality was far stranger. Hill spent decades creating characters who seemed trapped in a permanent state of confusion. His trademark expressions and exaggerated reactions made viewers wonder whether he was acting or simply being himself. Unlike many comedians who constantly reinvented their material, Hill rarely changed his approach. Even as television evolved, he continued relying on the same style that had made him famous years earlier. Critics often attacked him for refusing to adapt, yet he stubbornly continued doing exactly what he wanted. His personal life was equally puzzling. Despite earning enormous wealth, Hill lived surprisingly modestly and showed little interest in enjoying the luxuries available to him. Friends described him as a man who seemed detached from the world around him. What truly secured his place on this countdown was his refusal to recognize changing trends. While others adjusted to survive, Hill carried on as though nothing around him had changed. That stubborn determination helped build an empire, but it also created the impression of a star completely disconnected from reality. Number 13, Tommy Cooper. Now here is a man who turned failure into an art form. Tommy Cooper became famous by making audiences believe that absolutely nothing was going according to plan. Every performance looked like a disaster waiting to happen, and viewers could not get enough of it. His comedy worked because he appeared genuinely bewildered by the simplest situations. A card trick could collapse. A prop could malfunction. A routine could fall apart within seconds. Yet somehow Cooper transformed every mistake into laughter. Behind-the-scenes stories about him became almost as legendary as his performances. Crew members often recalled moments when Cooper seemed unable to keep track of basic instructions. He would wander through rehearsals creating unexpected chaos, and then somehow produce comedy from the confusion. Unlike polished entertainers who carefully controlled every detail, Cooper thrived on unpredictability. His large frame, combined with his puzzled expressions, created the image of a giant man constantly struggling to understand what was happening around him. The result was a character audiences adored. He seemed harmless, genuine, and wonderfully out of step with the world. That combination made Tommy Cooper one of Britain's most beloved comic stars and one of the most memorable examples of a performer whose entire image revolved around glorious confusion. Number 12, Sid James. Look no further than the Carry On films if you want to find a character who always believed he was the smartest man in the room while proving the opposite every few minutes. Sid James mastered that formula better than anyone. His trademark grin suggested he had a brilliant plan. The disaster that followed usually proved otherwise. Audiences loved watching him stumble through schemes that collapsed almost immediately. Whether he was chasing an opportunity or trying to outsmart someone around him, the result was usually embarrassment mixed with comedy. That became his signature style and helped make him one of Britain's most recognizable stars. Away from the cameras, James developed a reputation for taking risks that rarely made sense. Gambling fascinated him, and stories about questionable bets followed him throughout his career. Friends often joked that logic never stood between Sid and a decision. What made him unforgettable was his confidence. Even when every sign pointed toward failure, he carried himself like a master strategist. That combination of charm, stubbornness, and spectacular misjudgment created a screen persona audiences could not resist, and secured his place among Britain's greatest comic legends. Number 11. Charles Hawtrey. Imagine a performer who looked like a strict schoolteacher but behaved like someone completely disconnected from reality. That description fits Charles Hawtrey perfectly. His thin frame, nervous energy, and unusual mannerisms made him one of the most distinctive faces in British comedy. Unlike louder comedians, Hawtrey specialized in awkward confusion. He often appeared lost even when standing still. That quality became a major part of his appeal, because audiences never knew what strange reaction might come next. Stories from film sets only added to the legend. Hawtrey was known for becoming obsessed with tiny details that nobody else considered important. While everyone focused on completing a scene, he might become distracted by something completely unrelated. The behavior often left colleagues amused and occasionally frustrated. Yet that unpredictability helped make him memorable. He brought an odd energy to every performance that could not be copied. Viewers instantly recognized him the moment he appeared on screen. His career lasted for decades because he embraced his eccentric image rather than fighting it. Hawtrey may have seemed completely bewildered at times, but that bewilderment became one of the most effective comedy tools in British film history. Number 10. Bernard Bresslaw. Standing well over 6 feet tall, Bernard Bresslaw looked more like a heavyweight boxer than a comedy star. His size made him impossible to ignore. His screen persona made him impossible to forget. Rather than playing powerful heroes, Bresslaw often portrayed gentle giants who seemed confused by the world around them. Watching such an enormous man struggle with simple situations created instant comedy. Audiences laughed because his appearance suggested strength, while his characters often displayed remarkable cluelessness. Directors quickly realized they had something special. Bresslaw could walk into a scene and generate laughter before speaking a single word. His expressions alone suggested a man trying desperately to understand events unfolding around him. Off-screen, he gained a reputation as one of the friendliest people in the industry. Yet stories frequently emerged about absent-minded moments that sounded like scenes from one of his films. Those tales only strengthened his image as a lovable giant with more heart than common sense. His success proved that comedy does not always require sharp one-liners. Sometimes all it takes is a massive figure facing ordinary problems with complete confusion. Bernard Bresslaw turned that formula into a career and became one of the most beloved faces of British entertainment. Number 9. Oliver Reed. Some stars build careers through discipline. Oliver Reed seemed determined to test how much chaos a career could survive. Blessed with movie star looks and undeniable screen presence, he had everything needed to become one of Hollywood's most dependable leading men. The problem was that Reed rarely behaved like someone interested in being dependable. His reputation for wild behavior became almost as famous as his performances. Producers never knew what version of Oliver Reed would arrive on a set. Friends admired his fearless attitude, but executives often viewed it as a nightmare waiting to happen. What placed him on this countdown was his tendency to make life far more difficult than necessary. Opportunities appeared before him and sometimes vanished because he refused to play by ordinary rules. While others carefully protected their careers, Reed seemed to enjoy walking directly into trouble. Yet audiences loved him for exactly that reason. He felt unpredictable and authentic in a business filled with carefully managed personalities. Every appearance carried an edge, because nobody knew what might happen next. His legacy remains fascinating, because he possessed enough talent to become a conventional superstar, but chose a far more reckless path that made him unforgettable. Number 8. Diana Dors. Long before tabloids became obsessed with celebrity drama, Diana Dors was already making headlines. Marketed as Britain's answer to Hollywood glamour, she possessed charisma, confidence, and the ability to command attention whenever she entered a room. The challenge was that Dors rarely followed the carefully planned path expected of major stars. At a time when studios wanted complete control, she often made decisions that left executives scratching their heads. Instead of becoming the predictable image they wanted, she insisted on being herself. That independence created both opportunities and problems. While fans admired her honesty, industry insiders frequently viewed her as difficult to manage. Career choices that looked promising sometimes led nowhere, and personal controversies often overshadowed professional achievements. What makes her story unique is that she never stopped fighting for attention. Even when circumstances turned against her, she found new ways to remain relevant. That determination helped her survive setbacks that might have ended another career. Diana Dors was far from unintelligent. However, her willingness to ignore conventional wisdom repeatedly placed her in situations that seemed completely avoidable. That combination of confidence and questionable judgment keeps her firmly on this list. Number 7. Richard Burton. Few actors possessed a voice as powerful as Richard Burton. When he spoke, audiences listened. When he performed, critics paid attention. He was one of the greatest talents Britain ever produced. And yet his career often felt like a battle against his own decisions. Burton reached heights most actors only dream about. International fame, major awards, and enormous success all arrived during his career. Unfortunately, so did a reputation for excess. Friends and biographers frequently described a man who struggled to balance achievement with self-discipline. The strange part is that Burton fully understood many of the problems he faced. Unlike some stars who seemed unaware of their mistakes, he often recognized them clearly. Yet recognition rarely translated into change. Time after time, he returned to habits that complicated both his personal life and professional journey. That contradiction made him endlessly fascinating. Here was a brilliant performer capable of extraordinary insight, while simultaneously making choices that appeared remarkably self-destructive. Even so, his talent remained impossible to ignore. Burton's story is not one of failure, but of a gifted man whose greatest obstacle was often himself. Few careers demonstrate that conflict more dramatically than his. Number 6. Peter O'Toole. Here is the irony. Peter O'Toole possessed one of the sharpest minds in British cinema, yet spent years creating stories that made people question whether common sense had ever visited him. Tall, charismatic, and impossible to ignore, he became an international sensation through unforgettable performances that turned him into a Hollywood icon. The problem was that O'Toole often seemed determined to challenge limits nobody else would even approach. Tales of marathon parties, reckless adventures, and decisions that sounded unbelievable became part of his legend. What began as amusing stories eventually evolved into serious concerns among friends and colleagues who watched him push himself far beyond reason. Unlike many stars who carefully protected their image, O'Toole embraced unpredictability. He treated life like a grand performance where consequences were secondary to the experience itself. That attitude produced remarkable stories, but also created problems that followed him for decades. At one point, health issues became so severe that doctors questioned whether he would survive. Most people would view such a warning as a turning point. O'Toole somehow turned it into another chapter of an already outrageous biography. What keeps him high on this list is not a lack of intelligence. It is the astonishing gap between knowing better and doing better. Few actors demonstrated that contradiction more dramatically. Peter O'Toole often seemed determined to test fate itself, and somehow remained standing long enough to become a legend. Number 5. Stuart Granger. Not every foolish decision involves wild behavior. Sometimes it comes from believing nobody else's opinion matters. Stuart Granger built his career on confidence. Handsome, talented, and perfectly suited for adventure films, he quickly became one of the most recognizable British stars working in Hollywood. Success arrived early and frequently. Unfortunately, so did a reputation for arrogance. Directors admired his talent, but many struggled with his attitude. Granger often behaved like a man convinced he knew more than everyone around him. That confidence occasionally crossed into stubbornness and created conflicts that damaged important professional relationships. Hollywood has always tolerated difficult personalities when profits remain strong. The moment those profits begin to decline, everything changes. Granger learned that lesson the hard way. Opportunities gradually became harder to secure, and the industry grew less willing to overlook behavior that once seemed acceptable. What makes his story fascinating is how avoidable much of it appears in hindsight. He possessed the looks, the skill, and the experience needed for a much longer run at the top. Yet personal conflicts repeatedly created obstacles where none needed to exist. Granger never lacked ability. His challenge was convincing others that working with him was worth the effort. In an industry built on relationships that proved to be a costly mistake, his career remains a reminder that talent alone rarely guarantees lasting success. Number 4. Rex Harrison. For decades, Rex Harrison represented sophistication. Audiences saw elegance, confidence, and effortless charm whenever he appeared on screen. His performances made difficult roles look easy and helped establish him as one of Britain's most respected actors. Behind that polished image, however, existed a very different reputation. Harrison became known for behavior that frequently frustrated people around. Him co-stars described a man who could be brilliant one moment and incredibly difficult the next. He expected high standards from everyone, yet often showed little patience when those standards were not met. The unusual part was that Harrison seemed genuinely surprised when people reacted negatively. Time after time, he created tension through unnecessary confrontations, only to continue behaving exactly the same way. His success protected him for years because studios were willing to tolerate almost anything from a proven star. Eventually, circumstances changed. New faces arrived. Audience tastes evolved. Suddenly, the behavior that had once been ignored became far harder to justify. Hollywood executives who previously overlooked problems became less enthusiastic about dealing with them. What earns Harrison a place this high in the countdown is the way he repeatedly complicated situations through pride. He possessed every advantage an actor could want, yet often made life harder through his own actions. The result was a career filled with extraordinary achievements and equally extraordinary examples of self-inflicted trouble. Number 3. James Mason. By the time James Mason reached Hollywood, he already possessed the qualities of a classic leading man. He had the voice. He had the presence. He had the kind of intelligence that made every performance feel effortless. Yet despite all those advantages, Mason repeatedly found himself fighting battles that most stars wisely avoided. Rather than quietly accepting the rules of the studio system, Mason challenged them. He disliked being controlled and openly pushed back against powerful figures who expected complete obedience. While many actors protected their careers by staying silent, Mason often chose confrontation. It was a bold approach, but not always a smart one. The studio era was built on influence and relationships. Challenging the people who controlled major productions rarely ended well. Mason learned that success could disappear surprisingly fast when executives decided an actor was becoming more trouble than he was worth. What makes his inclusion on this list interesting is that his mistakes came from confidence rather than confusion. He believed talent should provide freedom. Hollywood believed talent should provide profit. Those competing views placed him on a collision course with the system. Even when opportunities became harder to find, Mason refused to completely change his approach. That stubborn independence earned respect from some and frustration from others. In the end, he remained one of Britain's finest actors, but also a man whose career might have reached even greater heights if he had chosen diplomacy over conflict. Number 2. Charles Laughton. Few performers in film history could match the sheer brilliance of Charles Laughton. His range was extraordinary. His screen presence was unforgettable. Critics praised him as one of the most gifted actors of his generation. Unfortunately, genius does not always arrive with practicality. Laughton developed a reputation for overthinking nearly everything. Directors often found themselves locked in endless discussions about scenes that seemed perfectly fine to everyone except him. While perfectionism can improve a performance, it can also exhaust the people trying to finish a movie. The deeper his career progressed, the more difficult those situations became. Laughton constantly searched for better solutions even when none were necessary. He questioned decisions. He challenged creative choices. He refused to accept easy answers. Sometimes that determination produced remarkable results. Other times it simply created frustration. Hollywood rewards talent, but it also values efficiency. Producers wanted films completed on schedule. Laughton wanted artistic certainty. Those goals did not always work together. As years passed, some major opportunities began slipping away because working with him required enormous patience. What places him near the top of this countdown is the simple fact that many of his struggles were self-created. He possessed enough ability to dominate any project, yet often complicated matters through relentless perfectionism. Charles Laughton was undoubtedly brilliant. The strange part is how often that brilliance made life harder instead of easier. Number 1, Robert Newton. And finally, we arrive at the star whose career became one of the most spectacular examples of wasted potential in British Hollywood history. Robert Newton had everything: talent, charisma, recognition. He created one of cinema's most famous pirate performances and left an influence that still shapes popular culture today. Yet for all his gifts, Newton repeatedly made decisions that pushed success further out of reach. His reputation for reckless behavior became legendary. Producers never knew whether they were hiring a brilliant actor or inviting chaos onto a production. The uncertainty followed him everywhere. Unlike stars who occasionally made mistakes, Newton seemed determined to collect them. Professional opportunities disappeared because of behavior that colleagues found impossible to manage. Important relationships suffered. Promising projects became complicated. Again and again, he placed obstacles directly in his own path. What makes his story so remarkable is how obvious the solution often appeared from the outside. The talent was already there. The audience already loved him. All he had to do was avoid creating new problems. Unfortunately, that proved easier said than done. By the later stages of his career, the consequences had become impossible to ignore. A man who could have enjoyed a far longer reign at the top instead became a cautionary tale. Robert Newton was not lacking in ability. He was lacking in judgment. That is why he earns the number 1 spot on this countdown. From lovable fools to self-destructive legends, these British stars proved that talent and wisdom are not always the same thing. Which entry surprised you the most, and who do you think deserved the number 1 spot? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this countdown, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us for the next unforgettable Hollywood story.